This video is sponsored by Flowkey. Welcome to the 700 subscriber Q&A session with me, David Bennett, piano. Do you think today's pop music on the whole is worse, less creative, less various, less influential than music from the 80s, 90s and 2000s? Or is it just different? First of all, it's important to remember the bias we can all have when we compare today's pop music with previous pop music, because inevitably what we do is we compare just a random pop song that we heard today with, in our head, some of the greatest music of all time that came out, 20, 30 years ago. So it's not a very fair comparison. If you take any year from the past, you will find really naff number one hits.
Everyone knows it's windy.
Sunshine and holidays.
My ding-a-ling, my ding-a-ling.
Paradise, but I've never been to me.
How it leads me back again. I didn't know how much I loved you.
But that said, I do think on average we see less creativity, less variety, less sort of alternativeness in the pop charts as we used to. We don't get Bohemian Rhapsodies anymore, we don't get Strawberry Fields Forevers or Paranoid Androids. But the reason I think is not because of a shift in how people write songs or what sort of music's out there, but a shift in how the music industry now works. If you think in the 1960s, there was only one way really to consume music, and that was the mainstream. The small amount of artists being played on the radio, on the TV, and talked about in the newspapers and the magazines. That was the only way to consume music. So all of the music, whether it be sort of cheap and cheerful throwaway pop music or interesting creative pop music like the Beatles, that all had to come down this one mainstream. But now with the internet, it's perfectly possible for an artist to have a massive following not in the mainstream. They can exist in this sort of niche world where the people in the mainstream don't necessarily even know they exist, but they're still having a massive impact, being listened to millions of times every day. Which Radiohead and Beatles songs do you consider to be underrated? For Radiohead, I would say The Daily Mail, which is only really underrated, I think, because it wasn't an album track, so it's very easy to miss it or forget about it, but absolutely bloody brilliant song.
You made a pig's ear. You made a mistake.
And as for the Beatles, one of my favourite Beatles songs that you don't hear talked about very often is Cry Baby Cry, which you can very much hear in that song the blueprint for a lot of the Britpop music that came later. Any thoughts on the possibility of AI created music in the future and what it could mean for musicians? So a lot of people have been talking about this recently, mainly because there's this AI art generator called DALL-E where you give it a prompt and it creates a really impressive original image based on the prompt that you gave it. But that's the thing, it's not actually an original image, it's a composite of existing art that it's pulled off the internet. And that would be the same case for AI music. It would be a composite of existing ideas. It would be writing music using things that have come before it. And of course that is actually how a lot of music is created even by humans, but humans have a way of being able to push beyond what's been done before and come up with something at least a little bit new. And I'm not sure whether AI would ever be able to do that. I guess it could, just randomly throw ideas together, but how would it know that it's a valuable idea? Most random combinations of notes are not going to sound nice. And even if you tried programming it with some sort of way of learning that, thirds sound nice, isn't it just going to come up with like a very generic, just third-based progression? It's never going to come up with anything particularly original, particularly groundbreaking. It will just be creating music that adds to the existing pile of, fairly disposable music. And, there are some environments where the music only needs to be disposable. Think like the background music in a insurance advert. That doesn't need to be groundbreaking. So perhaps those sort of environments for music will see AI become very prominent. You know, the TV producer for a TV series doesn't now have to hire and work with a music composer. They can just type in a brief into a program and come up with a generic sounding bit of underscore to put in the background of their daytime drama. And, you know, apart from the people who work on those programs, I don't think that would be a great loss to the world of music and art. I think one of the most interesting things we might see is AI being more of a tool for songwriters to use. You can imagine some sort of plugin on your DAW where, you know, you press a button and the AI throws up a bit of a random idea, and then you can take that and think, okay, that's pretty cool, I'll trim that bit off and I'll run with that. And that's like a hybrid of AI and human composition. And we kind of already have this to a certain extent, like quantizing, auto-tune. These are sort of AI things. Like, it's AI which is deciding that note that's there actually was meant to be there. And you know, people already have pretty big opinions on quantizing and AI, quantizing and auto-tune, and how that can impact the quality of music and the sort of humanity of music. But, you know, ultimately, I don't think anyone is ever going to find a substitute for true human expression and originality. Are you a fan of Elvis Presley and Justin Bieber? That sounds like a prompt you would give to an AI music creator. Elvis Presley, Justin Bieber hybrid. But yeah, to answer your question, Elvis, he's great, fantastic, one of the greatest of all time. Justin Bieber, he's not awful. He had a bad start, I guess, because he was very much that sort of teeny bop sensation. But some of the music he's done in more recent years is actually quite good. And for example, I like the song Love Yourself, which was penned by Ed Sheeran. How can I use major 7 chords or sus2 chords in a chord progression? So major 7, the most obvious way to use a major 7 chord is either on the 1st degree of the scale or the 4th degree. So if we're in C major, for example, you could have a C major 7 on the 1st degree, or a F major 7 on the 4th degree of the scale. And the reason those two locations work so well is you can form a major 7 chord on those 2 degrees and stay in the scale at the same time. You don't have to sort of venture outside of the scale. If you are feeling a bit more exotic though, you could add in a major 7 on the flat 3, E flat major 7 in this example. You could even add one in on the flat 2nd degree. So that's D flat major 7. And then we can resolve back to C major 7. So that's major 7 chords. You're talking about sus2 as well. Sus2, because they don't have a third, you know, C sus2 is neither major or minor because it hasn't got a third, which kind of makes them foolproof chords. You can throw them in anywhere and they'll work. So I think you can pretty much just move between any set of sus2 chords and they'll sound pretty cool together. That is what I'm doing here is C sus2, E flat sus2, F sus2 and A flat sus2, B flat sus2, G sus2, D flat sus2, C sus2. They're kind of, as I said, foolproof. We would like to know the best way to make bridges in pop and rock songs. The purpose of a bridge in a pop song or a rock song is ultimately to refresh the palate, refresh the listener's ear, because you've already heard 2 minutes, for example, of the same verse and chorus. You now need something new to keep things interesting and to add contrast before we return to the last chorus. So ultimately it needs to be different to the verse and chorus. It can't be the same old chord progression. Ideally, change key. A lot of songs change key for their bridge, but failing that, at least move to a different chord progression. Why do you think the Beatles never wrote a song in Phrygian? Well, the Beatles never wrote a song fully in the Phrygian scale, but they did have a song which had a sort of Phrygian moment, which is Things We Said Today, which is in the key of A minor, but at one point plays a B flat major chord, which is the flat second chord, a chord that you would get in A Phrygian.
How I will know someday when I'm lonely, wishing you weren't so far away, then I will remember.
When I think about creating music, I always get caught up on how big the landscape of music is, and it terrifies me that I may never add anything substantial to it. Any advice on getting over that feeling and possibly ever trying to make something truly unique musically? Well, if you're trying to create something that's truly unique musically, you're probably trying the wrong thing. Like, to be honest, I could just go... And that's unique, right? I doubt there's ever been a piece of music that sounded like that. But it sounded awful. And that's the thing, you don't need to create something unique. Most music sounds similar for a reason, because there's only so many combinations of notes that actually work. Now, obviously, there's more than just combinations of notes that create the sound of a song. You know, most of the distinction between one style and the next isn't what notes they're using, but what instrumentation are they using, what sounds are they using, or tones. So that can be an interesting thing to think about. Try thinking, what instruments could I use that maybe aren't used as much? How can I create a sound that hasn't been created before? So that can be a good kicking off point for creating something a bit new. But also, like I said before, don't get too hung up on creating something new, because you don't need to. You know, a lot of the greatest songs of all time are effectively just rehashes of previous greatest songs of all time. Various Things is asking why sometimes on published sheet music the key signature doesn't actually match the key of the music. So typically when people are taught key signatures, they're taught that this key signature, for example, is either the key signature of A major or F sharp minor. But actually, although the vast majority of songs using this key signature will be in A major or F sharp minor, not all of them will be. Because all this key signature is actually telling us is that this song has 3 sharps, C sharp, G sharp and F sharp. And there are more than 2 scales that have that set of sharps. There are actually 7 scales, 7 modes. A major and F sharp minor are 2 of the modes that could have this set of 3 sharps, but this song could equally be in E mixolydian or B Dorian. Now, confusion can arise because there's not as much consensus on how you choose your key signature for a modal piece of music. If a piece of music was in E mixolydian, for example, you might actually put it in an E major key signature and then just put a natural mark next to every D that occurs in the piece, because you're trying to let the performer know that the key of this is E, but we're not using the E major scale. But if you wanted to cut down on all of those accidentals that are now across our piece of music, you could just put it in a 3 sharps key signature, the A major key signature. So really, the true name for this key signature is 3 sharps, not necessarily A major. Flowkey is a really fluid, intuitive way to learn songs and learn how to read sheet music at the piano. Let me show you how it works. I've got it in hold mode at the moment, which means it's basically waiting for me to play the correct note. And if I play the wrong note, it knows it's the wrong note, so it won't continue. So it's giving you instant feedback on whether you're playing it correctly. We've also got this helpful display at the top showing a top-down view of the piano, so if you're not as fluid at reading sheet music, you can still work out how to play it. Why not try out Flowkey for free with a 1-week free trial? To get started today, follow the link down below. Who do you think are the greatest music producers? i.e. George Martin, Rick Rubin, Phil Spector, Jeff Lynne. Can the quality of production make or break a song? A good producer is effectively another member of the band. They're just as invested as any of the other members in making the song sound as good as possible. And they will get involved in the songwriting aspect of it, they'll get involved in the arrangement aspects of the song, to the point that nowadays it's quite standard that producers get a songwriting credit on pop songs, which is why pop songs nowadays have such long lists of songwriters. If George Martin and the Beatles were working today, George Martin definitely would have got a songwriting credit on the majority of the Beatles catalogue. He was so involved in the process, writing parts, performing parts, making arrangement decisions. He was a member of the band. Which leads me on to telling you my favourite producer of all time, which is probably no surprise, it's George Martin. George Martin was just such an innovator, such an open-minded person at a time when pop and rock music were considered this sort of cheap fad, and something that was second to the true music, which is classical music. But George Martin, despite his classical background, he knew that pop music and rock music could be just as emotionally engaging, just as important as classical music, and he applied that in his work. Really, George Martin is truly one of my idols as a musician. I would absolutely love a video or simply some advice on songwriting and composition. There's no right or wrong way to write a song, and you definitely don't need to understand every element of music theory to write a song. You don't actually need to understand anything about music theory. You can just start throwing stuff together and see what you like. The way I approach songwriting is I try to come up with some sort of little idea, maybe just a verse section or a chorus section. Maybe I've come up with this chord progression. And maybe I'll start humming some melodies over it, and when I arrive at something that I like, I'll record it onto my phone and then leave it, and then come back a day later or 2 days later, and that's when with your fresh ears you'll be able to tell whether that's something interesting that you should continue with, or whether it's something just a bit generic and boring that just ditch. And that's another key piece of advice I'll give is, do not be scared to ditch your songs. Do not get attached to your music. You need to be able to write loads of songs, and then hopefully one of them will be great. You can't expect to sit down and write 12 songs and have your first album. Realistically, you're going to be writing at least 50 songs to even yield 10 songs that are worth anything. Could you rate this weird chord progression? Esus4 E G E minor. Cool. The thing about having that sus4 at the beginning is it kind of hides whether this progression is major or minor, because there's no third. And then we hear it resolve down to E major, which is very satisfying. So we get that G sharp. Then moving to G, we're now getting the contrast of moving to the E minor key rather than the E major key, because we've got G natural here. And then that kind of follows through with E minor. And then by looping it, we get the sus4 again, which is a nice little kind of turnaround. It ties it all together nicely, because we're now, rather than going straight from E minor to E major, the sus4 kind of blends them. It hides whether the third's major or minor just for this one chord, so it kind of stitches them together nicely. So yeah, cool chord progression. Zaya was wondering, how important is it to read music for composing and performing? So it completely depends on the context in which you'll be working. For example, if you're working essentially with a rock band, with guitarists and drummers, that sort of thing, those types of musicians are less likely to expect sheet music, expect you to provide notation for the music you've written. But if you were working with a string quartet, they would very much be expecting you to arrive at the rehearsal space with the sheet music there to give to them. So it depends on what type of music you're making, what environment you're going to be in. Generally speaking, if you are aiming to play pop and rock music, aiming to write pop and rock music, you don't need to be able to read or write notation, but it will definitely come in handy from time to time. Radiohead? Yes. What is, in your opinion, the best song written in the last 60 years? If I had to choose one song to survive from the last 60 years of music, it would have to be Bohemian Rhapsody. I think that song ticks so many boxes on being objectively, if there is such a thing, the best song of the last 60 years. Robster is asking about the role that arranging plays in song composition. Arrangement is ultimately every element of the songwriting process apart from the initial composition of the melody and chords. Everything from choosing the instrumentation, choosing the sections, choosing what dynamics are we going to have. Is it going to be louder here? Is it going to be softer here? What's the mood going to be? All of those decisions are arrangement decisions. And a great way of seeing the impact that arrangement has on a song is looking at a cover version of a famous record. So for example, All Along the Watchtower by Bob Dylan is a very basic arrangement of that song. Obviously Bob Dylan wrote it, but he didn't do much more than that. He just sort of strummed the chord pattern and added a fairly standard basic band arrangement around it, a bit of harmonica. But when we look at Jimi Hendrix's version of All Along the Watchtower, we can see how, although it's the same essential song, it's the same melody, the same chord progression, the arrangement brings it to life. It makes the song. It's a completely different record. So arrangement is, in many ways, just as important as the initial composition of melody and chords. I've read on your website bio that you quit music lessons in your early teens and then taught yourself. I'm fascinated to hear about this, your motives for doing this, your successes, your failures during the process. I started taking piano lessons when I was 11 years old, and I quit when I was 13. And I didn't quit because I thought, I can teach myself better than this teacher ever could. I simply quit because I wasn't enjoying the lessons, and I was finding it really difficult. Now, in retrospect, I can see that I wasn't very good at that type of learning, that sort of sit-down, formal education. But at the time, all I was thinking is, I just don't enjoy this, I'm not going to do it anymore. And what could have happened at that point is I just never learned how to play the piano. But the piano remained in my house, and over the next couple of years, a lot of my close friends started learning how to play guitar or drums, and because I had this piano in the house and I had this basic understanding of how to play it, it kept me motivated to keep learning, keep teaching myself little things, not really thinking in terms of I'm one day going to be a professional musician, but just like, oh, I'd like to learn this little thing, or this is fun. I learned the 12-bar blues chord progression, I learned the blues scale, I would learn odd songs like Imagine by John Lennon. And over time that sort of just added up to the point that by the time I was 16, I started an A-level in music, and then did a degree in music, and then at that point my musical education was just in full swing. Any idea on what makes a song sound epic, like in the style of Europe's Final Countdown? So a big part of what makes a song sound epic is definitely the instrumentation and the arrangement, the dynamics. Final Countdown, definitely an epic song, but if you played it on recorders, it's not going to sound particularly epic anymore. But beyond that, I do think something that you can think about from a tonal perspective is if it's in a minor key. I think the minor key sounds more epic. It sounds more serious and dramatic. Taking Final Countdown, it's originally in F sharp minor, but if we put it in F sharp major, it just doesn't have the same impact. I've got a couple of questions here asking about Paul McCartney and Wings. What do I think of them? I've always thought it'd be really interesting to see a parallel universe where we didn't have the Beatles, but we did have Wings. We did have Paul McCartney's solo career, because obviously he had that advantage going into his solo career that he was already one of the most admired and recognised songwriters on the planet. But Wings, to me at least, Wings stand up on their own. They have some great records. They also have some pretty cheesy records.
Some people wanna fill the world with silly love songs.
I'm not sure I can go as far to say that McCartney gets back to the quality of songwriting he had in the Beatles, but that's a pretty big ask, and albums like Band on the Run are truly great albums. Is F over G going to C still technically a plagal cadence? So for those who don't know, a plagal cadence is the resolution of 4 to 1. So in the key of C major that would be F resolving to C. And for contrast, a perfect cadence, or what the Americans call an authentic cadence, is 5 going to 1. So that's G going to C. Now, F over G is this chord. G in the left hand and an F major triad in the right hand. But F over G is actually not, the most official name for this chord, the most technical name. It's more just a shorthand we use to make it easier to play it on the piano. Actually, this is a voicing of a G11 chord. all we're missing is the third and the fifth. It's still technically and sort of functionally a G dominant 11 chord, which means this G, F over G going to C is not a plagal cadence, it's a perfect cadence because it's a G chord, a 5 chord, going to 1. Hypnotist NYC was wondering if I could analyse some of the music theory behind the chord progressions of either Dex Dark by Radiohead or Stepping Out by Joe Jackson. So it's interesting that you mentioned both of those songs because both of those songs are using the same technique in their chord progression known as modal interchange or modal mixture, which is a fancy name for blending together the major scale and the minor scale and sometimes some other scales, some other modes. As we can see when we look at the chord progressions for these songs, some of these chords belong to the major scale and some of these chords belong to the parallel minor scale. This blending of the major and minor tonality together gives us that bluesy sound which we hear in so many different rock songs. Would you consider doing a video analysing the music theory of Girl From Ipanema? Girl From Ipanema is definitely a really interesting song, but I won't be doing a video on it because Adam Neely has already made a fantastic video on the topic which I couldn't possibly top. How were you like as a child? My defining characteristic as a child was being painfully shy. I was really timid as a child, which makes it all the more absurd that I'm doing a career like this where I get on stage and I talk in front of a camera. It was ultimately music though. It was getting into music as a teenager that just forced me into getting on stage and then subsequently just getting more confident. So yeah, just another reason why learning music is a great idea. What have you been listening to most recently, new albums that you would recommend? Rina Sawayama is an artist that I've discovered recently who blends sort of Ariana Grande style pop music with Linkin Park style nu metal. It's a great combination. Check out STFU. What's your third favourite band or artist? So if you've been paying attention, you'll know that my favourite artist is the Beatles, my second favourite is Radiohead, and my third favourite is actually a much more recent artist, it's Phoebe Bridgers. Do you think that you have to be in only one key or that you can be in several keys at once? So most pieces of music will effectively be in one key, one obvious key at a time, but really the concept of key is kind of subjective. It basically comes down to which note you perceive as the tonic note. And in some pieces of music, particularly sort of modal pieces of music, there can be a bit of ambiguity about which note is actually the tonic note. There can be more than one note that sounds like it could be the tonic. This is something I looked at in my video about Karma Police, where I found that some people heard it in the key of A minor and some people heard it in the key of E minor. Because the notes of the chords and melody didn't really give us enough context to decisively tell our ears this is in the key of A minor or this is in the key of E minor. We were sort of in this ambiguous limbo land between the two. Another famous example is Sweet Home Alabama, which Adam Neely made a whole video about. Another way that we could be in more than one key at a time is what's called polytonality, where one line of the music is in C major, for example, and the other line is in D major. Now, when you actually hear that piece of music, effectively those two keys condense down into one tonal experience. But from the point of view of the players, one is thinking in terms of C major and one is thinking in terms of D major. Who is your favourite music YouTuber? Well, I've already mentioned his name several times already. It's Adam Neely. And this takes me on to the next question, which is what inspired you to start your YouTube channel? I've been interested in YouTube for a very long time, since I was about 13 or 14 years old when YouTube was still very new. And I've been sort of dabbling in video making ever since, but this channel here only really happened once again because I was introduced to the videos of Adam Neely. I had never considered this format where you're teaching music, but it's not just dry old tutorials where you're just walking through a song or standing with a whiteboard talking about a music theory concept. it's far more interactive and engaging. Are you ever going to release original music under the band you were talking about? So yes, a while ago I mentioned that I was putting together a band to record some original songs I've written, and that is still happening. The wheels are turning. You know, I've just got lots of things going on, which means that you know, I can go months without making progress on a certain project, but that project is going to happen. I'm very excited about it. I'm a little bit nervous about it, but it should be done in the first part of next year, I imagine. Do you believe that it's no longer possible for musicians in the present day to be successful without the help of social media? That's a bit like saying, would it be possible in the 1960s to be successful without radio play? Or successful in the 1980s without MTV play? I think really social media and, you know, the extensions of social media, such as streaming websites, are the way that people discover and consume music, particularly new music. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think in many ways it's broken down the barriers, it's removed gatekeepers. So you can now create a career in music, you can find an audience without having to first get signed to a major record label. Who is the better piano man, Elton John or Billy Joel? They're definitely like parallel entities, aren't they? They're like the American and British piano man. From a technical point of view, it's hard to say. They're both fantastic. From what I've heard of them both, I think Billy Joel is probably technically the better piano player, but they're both amazing songwriters, amazing piano players, and I love them both. And if I can only listen to one for the rest of my life, which is a very hard decision to make, it might have to be Elton, but it's very difficult. They're both fantastic. Thoughts on this chord progression? C sus2, C sus2 sharp 4 omit 5, G major 7 over D, F major 7 over G. It's definitely an interesting chord progression. One thing to bear in mind is the way you've named some of these chords. C sus2, that's fine. C sus2 sharp 4 omit 5 is unnecessarily long. You could just call it C sus2 flat 5 and you'd have the same set of 3 notes. G major 7 over D, that's fine. F major 7 over G, that is fine, although it can be useful to think about it as a voicing of a G13 chord. But, you know, to be honest, if I was playing this in a song, I would prefer to read F major 7 over G. It's just a bit easier to process, but it's good to be aware of that when you're sort of analysing a progression. Is there a common stepping up chord progression similar to the stepping down major progression you made a video about? Yes, in the video I was mentioning earlier, my recent video about chord progressions, common chord progressions, I talked about what I call the major scale climb, where you go from chord 1 to chord 2 to chord 4 and chord 5. C, D minor, F,